My name is Rachel Lynn, and up until the moment everything shifted, I was the Senior Strategic Advisor at Daymark Global. I had spent the past 8 months developing a $72 million proposal for Andros International, a deal that had the potential to redefine not just our client portfolio, but my entire professional arc. That morning, I was leading the final pitch, standing in front of 12 executives seated around a high-gloss conference table, every slide timed, every stat ready, every outcome mapped. The room was calm, almost too quiet. You could hear the faint hum of the lights, the subtle clicks of styluses tapping against tablets. I was mid-sentence explaining how Phase 2 of the rollout would streamline operations across 3 continents when the notification slid across my tablet like a scalpel. Rachel Lynn. Employment terminated effective immediately. Please exit the systems post-pitch. I didn't react. Not outwardly. My mouth kept moving. I shifted seamlessly into the next line of the presentation, answering a question from their COO without so much as a blink. Inside, I felt the rush of blood to my face, the disorientation of betrayal hitting at full speed. But I stayed where I was. I stood tall and finished what I came to deliver. No one else in the room saw the notification. None of them knew that the company I was representing had just cut me off in real time. But I did, and with every breath, I decided not to give them the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. I completed the cost analysis breakdown. I fielded questions about scalability, long-term integration, and projected return metrics. I even cracked a light remark when their finance chief asked if we'd considered local vendor partnerships. My voice never wavered. When the final slide faded, I closed my tablet, slowly thanked everyone for their time, and stepped away from the screen. I nodded at the Andros CEO, offered a professional smile, and walked out of the room like I had every right to be there, which I did. They thought firing me mid-pitch would silence me, erase me, maybe even humiliate me. But they underestimated the one thing I never gave away: control. I didn't return to the Daymark office. I didn't clean out my desk or wait for some awkward HR debrief. My laptop, my notes, even my keycards, they were irrelevant now. Because while they'd been preparing to discard me, I had already been building something else. Something stronger. Something mine. I remember the moment the elevator doors closed. I exhaled once. Not because I was defeated, but because I was finally free. They had tried to write my ending. What they actually did was hand me the pen, and I already knew what the first sentence of my next chapter would be. 3 months before that pitch, I sat across from our CEO, Martin Hale, in his corner office. The city stretched out behind him, all glass and skyline, but his attention was fixed squarely on me. He leaned back in his chair and told me he needed something big, something bold but realistic. A full proposal to merge our 3 strategic units into one cohesive powerhouse. It was an idea that had floated around in executive memos for years, but no one had dared commit to it. Martin said he trusted me, said I had the mind to pull it off and the track record to make it stick. I took the challenge seriously, not just because of what it meant for the company, but because of what it meant for my role in shaping its future. I spent the next 3 weeks deep in data diagrams and deadlines. I interviewed department leads, built integration models, and accounted for every risk I could think of, from cultural clashes to system incompatibilities. The result was a 78-page framework that laid out the entire merger path over 24 months. It was structured, scalable, and quietly ambitious. When I handed it to Martin, he read the first 20 pages right there in front of me. He nodded, smiled, and said this was exactly what he needed. That night, I let myself believe I had just taken a major step forward in my career. I had no idea I had just handed my future to someone else. 2 days later, I walked into a strategy summit expecting to see my name on the agenda. Instead, Lucian Brandt was already at the front of the room pulling up slides I had created, word for word, graphic for graphic. The title had changed, though. It now read, Strategic Integration Proposal by Lucian Brandt, with contributions from the operations team. I felt the heat rise behind my ears. For a second, I thought maybe this was a mistake. Maybe he was going to reference me. But he didn't. Slide after slide, he presented my work as if it had been his vision all along. The same talking points, The same sequencing, the same analysis, and when his eyes finally met mine across the room, there was no apology. Just a smirk, a challenge. I didn't react, not visibly. I nodded once, took notes, kept my expression neutral while my stomach churned. My colleagues, most of whom had no idea I had authored the entire thing, nodded along in approval. Martin stood off to the side, smiling proudly, as if Lucian had invented fire and brought it to the boardroom. That night I created a new folder on my personal drive. I called it Meridian Contingency. I wasn't planning to use it for anything in particular, just a place to keep records, screenshots of draft dates, emails showing submission trails, metadata from original files. I didn't feel angry. Not yet. What I felt was clarity. The kind that only comes when you finally realize you've been invited to play a game where the rules don't apply to you. I had been too focused on delivering results to notice the shift. Lucian wasn't just an ambitious newcomer. He was someone being positioned, and I was becoming expendable. So I started paying attention. I watched who got copied on which emails. I tracked which meetings I was suddenly no longer invited to. The signs were subtle at first. Then they weren't. My name began disappearing from the team docs I'd created. Permissions quietly changed. Projects I had owned were suddenly listed under others. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't demand recognition or cause a scene. Instead, I began preparing, not out of paranoia, out of pattern recognition. You only get blindsided once in your career if you're smart. I wasn't going to let it happen again, not without a plan, not without a way out. It started with a permissions change. A shared document I had built, maintained, and updated for over a year suddenly showed me as a viewer instead of an editor. I refreshed the screen thinking it might be a glitch, but the settings held. I sent a polite email to IT, who responded that the change had come from operations. No explanation, no courtesy heads up. Then came the emails. Threads I used to be copied on automatically were suddenly going silent. I'd find out about project decisions through secondhand chatter or not at all. My name, once a fixture in internal reports and client updates, began fading like background noise. It wasn't blatant, at first just inconvenient. But over time, it formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. Talia started appearing in those spaces instead. She had been on my team for barely a year. I liked her. She was smart, eager to learn, and respectful. I had mentored her through her onboarding, helped her prep for her first external meeting, and even reviewed her first few client memos line by line. Watching her now suddenly looped into high-level discussions, I wasn't invited to felt like seeing your own shadow walk ahead of you. At first I told myself this was normal. Exposure opportunities, growth tracks, the kind of developmental handoff that happens in every company. But the timing was off. Talia hadn't asked for these new roles. She had simply been given them, and no one had asked me to guide the transition. They expected me to pretend it wasn't happening. Then came the meeting. My manager asked me to let Talia shadow me on the Andros project, the biggest account in our pipeline, the one I had personally developed from prospecting to pitch stage. The phrasing was casual, like it was about mentorship. I smiled, said I'd be happy to involve her. What I didn't say was that I already knew what this meant. Shadowing wasn't preparation. It was succession. Talia didn't know, not at first. She followed my lead with genuine curiosity, took notes diligently, and asked thoughtful questions. But she started getting CC'd on messages I wasn't on. And when she forwarded one to me for visibility, her tone was apologetic. I could tell she sensed the shift too, even if she didn't have the full picture. Meanwhile, Lucian was everywhere. His name now topped the strategic initiative dashboards I used to manage. He had regular check-ins with Martin, casual hallway chats with people I used to meet behind closed doors. He didn't push me out with force. He did it with charm, with polish, and with silence. That made it harder to pin down and even harder to resist. By the time HR reached out to schedule a role review, I knew exactly what was coming. They used words like realignment and structure optimization. I nodded, smiled, and played along. I had already begun documenting everything. Not because I expected a battle, but because I wanted clarity. I wasn't angry. I was awake, and I knew I needed to be ready. That night after the HR meeting, I opened my laptop and pulled up the employee contract I had helped revise 2 years earlier. Clause 14.3, Portfolio Retention Rights. It gave employees legal access to work they had directly authored for use in professional documentation and non-competing portfolios. I hadn't thought much of that clause when I helped draft it. Now it was my first line of protection. I began backing up files. Not client data or confidential numbers. Just the frameworks I had built. The models, templates, and strategic plans that carried my imprint. I moved them to a private cloud drive labeled Reference Materials. Every export was meticulous, every file renamed and tagged. I didn't rush. I wasn't covering my tracks. I was preserving my voice. A week later, I sent 2 messages. One to Ava Mills, a sharp compliance specialist I'd worked with for years. The other to Naomi Jensen, a former finance director who had since moved into independent consulting. We met at a quiet wine bar uptown, a place with soft lighting and private corners. We talked business like old friends. Until we didn't. I told them I wasn't starting a war. I was just building a parachute. A fallback that could turn into something real if it needed to. Ava leaned in first. She asked the right questions. Naomi listened more than she spoke. Neither one flinched. They knew the game as well as I did, and they were tired of playing by someone else's rules. We agreed to keep it quiet. No emails, no paper trail, just a single folder created that night on a fresh drive. We named it Halcyon. It didn't mean anything yet, but it could. I laid out my vision, a firm built on strategy, not politics. On delivery, not credit. They didn't promise anything that night. They didn't have to. I wasn't asking for loyalty. I was asking for clarity. As I walked home, I felt no guilt, no anger, just resolve. They were building a narrative where I was obsolete. I was building a space where that version of me didn't exist, not to get revenge, just to have something ready when the floor finally gave out. Because by then, I planned to be already standing somewhere solid, on something I built myself. The morning of the Trident pitch, I arrived early. I had rehearsed the presentation so many times that I could have delivered it in my sleep. The conference room on the 42nd floor was sleek and cold, all chrome and glass. 12 executives sat in a row, their expressions unreadable. I greeted them with steady confidence, took my position at the head of the table, and launched into the opening segment. By the time I reached slide 9, the room had shifted. Eyes were locked in. The CFO, known for being impossible to impress, had started nodding at my projections. I was walking them through a layered implementation model when my tablet screen pulsed. A system notification slid into view, sharp and final. Rachel Lynn. Employment terminated effective immediately. Please exit the system's post-pitch. For a full second, the air left my lungs. My brain raced, then slowed. No one else in the room saw it. No one heard the silence ringing in my head. I looked back up and kept speaking. My voice didn't crack. My fingers didn't shake. I tapped to the next slide with perfect timing. I continued with a breakdown of market impact. I explained how Trident's logistics network could be restructured for a 26% efficiency gain. I referenced previous case studies, spoke about implementation stages, and answered follow-ups with precision. Not one of them knew I had just been erased from the company I was representing. Not one of them saw that I was delivering results for a team that had decided I was no longer worth keeping. But I did. And every second that passed after that notification was a choice. I chose professionalism. I chose grace. Not for them, but for myself. Because this presentation, this deal, this entire opportunity was mine. I had built it. They were just borrowing it until I left the room. When the final slide faded, I paused, smiled, and thanked them for their time. I answered 2 more follow-up questions, closed my tablet, and walked to the door. I didn't look back. I didn't wait for applause or a handshake. I didn't need either. I had already won the room. I just wasn't taking it with me. I stepped into the hallway and let out one breath. That was it. Then I kept walking. Not toward the elevators that led to my old office, but toward the ones that would take me straight to the ground floor. I didn't need to pack anything. My plans had been in motion long before this morning. I had seen the signs. I had made my copies. I had built the fallback. In the parking lot, I sent a single message to Ava and Naomi. Horizon is live. That was our signal. A quiet green light to shift everything we had prepared into action. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel shocked. What I felt was clean. Like someone had ripped the final page out of a book I no longer wanted to finish. They thought removing me mid-pitch would diminish my credibility. Instead, it magnified it. Because I delivered one of the strongest pitches of my life while being dismissed in real time, and they didn't even notice. That kind of composure isn't something you fake. It's something you earn. It's what clients remember. It's what builds trust. What they ended that morning wasn't my job. It was just my chapter at Daymark. And I was already drafting the next one, with clearer eyes, with stronger allies, and for the first time on my terms. By the end of that day, word had already started to circulate. Not officially. Just quiet pings from old colleagues, confused texts from team leads, a ripple of surprise spreading through the office I had just left. But I wasn't focused on Daymark anymore. I was focused on Trident, because I knew the next move wouldn't come from me. It would come from them. Less than 24 hours after the presentation, Trident's CTO emailed Martin Hale directly. She thanked the team for the pitch, noted the strength of the proposed roadmap, and made one simple request. She asked that I be confirmed as the lead contact for the next phase of planning. The reply she received didn't mention me. It named Lucian as the new point of contact. Trident didn't argue. They didn't escalate. They just responded with a notice all contract discussions were on hold pending internal review. The wording was clinical, but the message was crystal clear. They didn't want the company. They wanted the relationship. And that relationship had just been cut out of the loop. I waited 48 hours. Then I sent a short, respectful email to the CTO. I thanked her for the opportunity to work together, let her know I was no longer with Daymark, and wished her team the very best in their transformation efforts. At the end, I added a line. If I could ever be of help under my new venture Halcyon strategy, she was welcome to reach out. There were no accusations, no shade, just a fact. A door gently left ajar. Later that week, Daymark scrambled. There were internal calls, frantic follow-ups, and reassurances sent out. But it was too late. Trust doesn't move on command. It moves on connection. And mine with Trident had been built over 8 months of real collaboration, not a handoff during a reshuffle. When I heard that the contract was formally suspended, I didn't gloat. I didn't post about it or make statements. I just poured another cup of coffee and kept building. Because trust is currency, and if you manage it right, it returns in ways titles and budgets never will. What collapsed that week wasn't a deal. It was the illusion that people are interchangeable. They're not. And some clients know the difference. We didn't waste time. The minute Trident paused the contract, Ava, Naomi, and I flipped every switch we had been quietly wiring for months. Halcyon's strategy was no longer a folder on a shared drive. It became Altovia, a legal entity, a living framework, a real alternative. We activated the infrastructure, secured our cloud systems, and finalized our core messaging. We didn't rush, but we didn't hesitate. Everything had been designed with intent. Within 72 hours, we had a functioning operation, a temporary workspace, and 3 early proposals ready to customize. We weren't building from scratch. We were launching something pre-built in silence. Trident was the first to reach out, not directly at first. Just a note from a mid-level director asking if I was available for an informal consultation. I kept the response simple. Yes, I was, and Altovia was happy to support client transformation efforts where trust and clarity were core values. After that, it didn't take long. A second inquiry came from a healthcare firm I had worked with 2 years earlier. Then a referral from a logistics lead who had followed my work on LinkedIn. We didn't chase, we answered, and the work spoke louder than any announcement ever could. I didn't mention Daymark in any conversation. I didn't compare or compete. I didn't have to. Altovia wasn't built in opposition. It was built in response. Not as a rebuttal, but as a refinement. A better answer to the question I had been trying to solve for years: what does strategy look like when it's not buried under ego? The early clients came cautiously, then confidently. We delivered ahead of schedule. We built dashboards that they didn't have to ask for. We returned calls before the second ring. And slowly word began to spread, not as gossip, but as proof. The kind that doesn't need headlines. Back at Daymark, I'm sure the conversations were louder. More meetings, more spin, but I didn't track them. I didn't need to. Because while they were patching leaks, we were laying the foundation. Altovia wasn't created to win back what I had lost. It was created to grow what I had always known was possible. And in that quiet rise, in that refusal to retaliate, I found the kind of victory that doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to last. Altovia grew deliberately. We didn't chase headlines or throw around promises we couldn't keep. We focused on what mattered: clarity of purpose, sharp execution, and treating people like they were more than a resume. Every new hire was chosen for mindset first, not pedigree. Strategy wasn't a department, it was our language. We built a culture that didn't worship titles or protect egos. Everyone had a voice, and every voice had weight. If someone raised a red flag, it didn't get buried. It got heard, discussed, and solved. Meetings were short and meaningful. Success was measured in outcomes, not noise. A few months in, I got a message from Talia. She didn't ask for anything at first, just said she missed the kind of work we used to do together before it got political. When we met for coffee, she looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from trying to pretend things are still working when they're clearly broken. She didn't say much about Daymark, and I didn't ask. What mattered was that she still believed in doing work that meant something. I told her if she ever wanted to bring that belief somewhere new, we'd talk. 3 weeks later, she joined Altovia as our client experience director. She wasn't the only one. Others followed. Some I had worked with, some I had mentored. All of them were looking for the same thing. Not revenge, not rescue. Just a place where their thinking could breathe again. Altovia wasn't perfect, but it was real, built on trust, run on logic, protected by a culture we didn't have to explain to new people because they felt it the moment they walked in. That was the difference. That was the shift. And quietly it began to ripple outward. 1 year later, I stood in the lobby of our new headquarters. It wasn't flashy, but it felt like us. Clean lines, warm, light, quiet energy. The Altovia logo hung above the reception desk. And just beneath it, in small letters, was my name, Founder. Not for recognition. Just to remind myself how far clarity can take you when everything else falls away. I walked past the glass-walled conference room where a team was workshopping a new proposal. No one looked over. They didn't need to. The work had rhythm now. People moved with purpose because they believed in the process. There was no fear of being sidelined, no pretending, no politics, just good thinking and better execution. I didn't think about Daymark often anymore. Not out of bitterness, out of distance. That part of my life had closed like a finished book. I learned what I needed to learn. I carried the useful parts forward and left the rest behind. It was never about proving them wrong. It was about proving to myself that I didn't need to stay small to be safe. Altovia was never built to compete. It was built to create. And that creation had become a home for people who wanted to work with integrity, not against each other. Every meeting, every contract, every new hire reaffirmed the decision I made when I walked out of that pitch room with my dignity intact. Some endings aren't losses, they're redirects. Quiet revolutions that begin the moment you realize your value was never tied to the space that tried to contain it. I didn't fight my way back. I just stepped forward and built something that finally fit the shape of who I really was. That was the win, and it's still unfolding.